Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Oliver White panel discussion on redefining the new normal. We have 3 Oliver White partners with you today to go through the questions that you've previously submitted and also to accept and answer any questions that you may want to submit to us directly today. So just as an orientation, we're going to be taking you through those previously submitted questions. We'll be answering them in turn, and we will also be conducting some polls as we go through the day. So we'll be posing questions to you as an audience and be feeding back the answers that we receive as we go. So it'll be obvious to you when we get to a polling question, and we'll explain a little bit more about what to do at that point. If there are any questions that you'd like to ask live during the session, use the chat facility, and we'll be monitoring it as we go through the session. And we'll pick and choose questions to answer that we think could be interesting and relevant to you all. So introduction from the 3 of us. My name is Gary Connors, and I'm a partner with the Oliver White business. We have joining me today on the panel discussion, Birgit. Hello, Birgit.
Hi, nice to meet you.
And Dawn Dent.
Hi, everybody.
Hello, Dawn. Hi. So without further ado, I think we'll kick off with the first question. And we're going to pose this question to you, Birgit. And this question was asked by many of the delegates. How do you run an IBP process when forecasting is just guesswork due to the COVID-19? Birgit?
Thanks, Gary. Yeah, thanks, Gary. I love this question. We actually do get this a lot, even without COVID-19. It is this, we can't forecast our business. We don't have a crystal ball, but in reality, we all have a view of the future, right? And with COVID, as much as with generally customer and consumer demand and where this is going. So in anticipating demand, what is key is that we have assumptions. So take the example of COVID. We all have different angles and different views of when things go back to normal and what is the new normal, right? So how is this going to look like? So if I just again take the current situation, we're all in home office. So some of my customers actually stayed open during this time. Some of them are slowly going back now, and for others they announced they are not going back earlier to September. So in any forward projection of what this is going to be, what this is going to do to our people, but then also to the consumer demand in reality, it is about the assumptions that we have about that. So what is the timing for the timing that we think this is going to be? What's the thinking behind what drives the number? So why do we think it takes a certain amount of time? Why do we think it will potentially take longer? And again, from a different functional perspective, looking at what does that mean for the business and understanding why others think this may take longer and this way may not. Actually, my husband and I had loads of discussions about that. How big is it going to be, the impact, and what is it going to be? But the key is then that we're achieving cross-functional consensus about these assumptions that we have, that we finally come to one plan, one set of numbers, and we know how we're going about that. And then we'll talk more about scenario management later as well, is then how to deal with different outcomes that we have. But it's key that we have those the assumptions and we have the cross-functional alignment. Another important factor for me is staying true to the purpose of demand planning. So get out of the weeds, and what people have a tendency to do is manage the here and now, and that is important, but we usually have other teams to do that as well. So very key that we still drive our destiny, and we're looking at where the demand is going to be over that time horizon as well. And actually, I'm working with one company that just we just finished design at when COVID started, They have run their cycles ever since, all virtual. Anyway, quite virtual and good at that. But already in the May cycle, they said we are no longer talking COVID short term. In the demand review, we are actually looking at when is it finishing, how we're going to respond, what is the potential customer demand, what opportunities, etc. on the longer run. So really in the IBP horizon, but really dealing once a month with that demand on the forward-looking. I don't know if you have anything to add.
Well, I would just say, given the question, if the questioner was also talking about the other aspects of the IBP process, so from a supply perspective, what Birgit was saying is absolutely true as well. So as a supply community, you should also be agreeing your assumptions going forward about what's happening with the supply base, for example, and beyond, where you've already made decisions for the short term about your own production and logistics operations, looking at the demand plan and the assumptions underpinning that demand plan, you should be able to equally come up with your supply plan to meet that demand, and based on assumptions about what's going to be possible with your supply base. Well, just also to help those who are interested in this question, we do have a white paper on our website called Uncertain Outlook, which you may want to take a look at.
Yeah, that's a great addition, Dawn. Thanks for that. Now, the next question, actually, that was also high in the polls there from the audience, Dawn, is directed to you. So what's the right planning horizon during this crisis, and how do we remain agile in short term? Also, should we create emergency processes or just follow the SNOP IBP general methodology?
Okay, Birgit, thank you. Yeah, so we are having this discussion again with quite a few clients at the moment, because I think for some people there is a tendency to think they need to go into some emergency process. But what we would say, and what we're seeing done very successfully, is to maintain and leverage your existing governance process. So, you should have your monthly SNOP or IBP process in place, and you need to keep that going, as Birgit was mentioning, to plan the midterm. So, we're talking here about a rolling 24 or 36 months, depending on your business and the maturity of the process, whilst you have in parallel and connected to it your daily and weekly governance process, which we're currently calling integrated tactical planning. You may call it something else, but it has a different cadence, obviously, as I mentioned, daily and weekly, and it's focused on the short term, so typically 0 to 3 months. But it's still taking your IBP plan or your SNOP plan from that midterm and disaggregating it down into a greater level of detail for execution, and managing changes. So clearly, COVID, your IBP process will have made assumptions and forward plans, as Birgit said, to in this environment about and making assumptions about when you think you're going to start resuming to more normal levels of demand, normal levels of production. For some of you, that's going to mean that demand will fall from very heightened levels, potentially, to more normal market levels. For others of you, hopefully it means if you've seen a very great reduction in your demand, it will start to pick up again as different sectors open back up. But nevertheless, you're still going to have changes that you will manage over the midterm with your IBP process, and changes potentially in your short-term horizon, which you should manage through your daily and weekly governance process. Each of the processes should be connected, obviously, as we're taking the IBP plan and executing it as faithfully as possible with the daily and weekly governance process. Equally, once a month, what we're learning from that daily and weekly governance process, we should be communicating through to our colleagues in the IBP process, so that they can improve the quality of their plan over the midterm. So, for us, there really isn't a need to create separate processes to deal with COVID. You should be able to use your existing structures to manage the crisis as you would any other disruption or vulnerability or risk. For agility, you talked about how do we remain agile in the short term. Well, the first thing that you need to know, which you need to know anyway, is the level of flexibility in your supply chain. So pre-COVID, hopefully you will have understood the level of agility and flexibility you've proactively built into your supply chain, in terms of the way you've set your inventory profile, the way you're able to flex capacity potentially in your different facilities, or indeed move production from one facility to another. And equally, you should be understanding the level of flexibility and agility that your suppliers are capable of, particularly your key suppliers. Now, in terms of what's happened during this crisis, you do need to understand how that agility may have changed. So, you know, having your procurement people or material planning team talk to your suppliers is really important right now, to find out, you know, who's open, where are they geographically, and where are they in terms of the pandemic curve right now. So you may be finding that some of your Asian suppliers and some of those in continental Europe are starting to move back to full production now. They may still have some problems with transportation, but ask them about that. You know, where are their challenges right now in resuming normal supply into you? I'm talking to a client yesterday, and they've found, in fact, their key supplier has more capacity right now for them because some of their competitors are closed. So, so some of their other customers are not taking their normal volume. But that's not going to last forever. So it's really about regularly, not doing this once, but regularly reaching out to suppliers, as well as your own plant network and warehouse network, to see what level of agility and flexibility have they got now, and how might that change going forward over time. So hopefully that helps answer those questions. Again, we have a couple of white papers here that you might want to take a look at. One of them is called Effective Execution of S&OP IBP Plans through ITP, so through Integrated Tactical Planning. And the other is called Inventory as a Consequence. So again, they will be on our website, and we can send you the details of those, the links to those if you're interested. Gary or Birgit, would you like to add anything?
Yeah, I just looked at the questions. There's a couple of questions coming in, and great people are making use of that as well, which just builds on what Dawn said, and just emphasizing the point that actually in a pandemic like this, it actually shows how good your IBP process really has been, because it shouldn't become one of the comments is a war room, right? It shouldn't be getting you into the here and now, but it is a monthly process to drive your future. And yes, it changes, you know, some attention and some of the factors that need to be revisited, like the assumptions I was mentioning earlier. But in reality, if your IBP is more in, now we need a weekly update and we need quicker decision, is actually what Dawn said is the short-term management process, which you should have in place anyway to execute your IBP plan, and that should be the forum that is in key attention here. So it is definitely a test, but in a you know, if it is solid and mature, your IBP will not change. Your integrated tactical planning will have a lot of attention to manage that exception. But it's that monthly step back and driving your future, that is key.
Yeah, good question. Thank you very much for that. Gary, the next question is for you. What's the role of scenario planning during the crisis, and how often should scenarios be challenged?
Thanks, Dawn. It's a great question, isn't it? And we've spoken a lot about integrated business planning so far. And scenario planning in a mature organization is a fundamental piece of integrated business planning. It is the process that you should use for creating the scenarios, identifying possible future scenarios. It is the process that you should use for approving your responses to those scenarios, and also the process that you should use for monitoring how scenarios are playing out over time. Now, we see two different levels of maturity around scenario planning, and the one may be what a lot of our clients are doing today is an event has happened, and in order to navigate a way out of the event, like the COVID crisis, there are various scenarios that are thought through to see, is this going to be a quick recovery? Is it going to be a protracted recovery? And that's an approach for how you could use scenario planning. Preferably, however, I'd advocate a more proactive approach for scenario planning by identifying critical events ahead of the time before they happen. And I draw on having spent a lot of my career in the hazardous chemical manufacturing industry. Scenario planning is something the health and safety industry use very, very well. So in any hazardous chemical factory, you will identify scenarios of things that may go wrong in the factory. And for each scenario, you will have worked up a response for how you would deal with it. If the scenario is a major chlorine leak, your response would be a detailed document about how you would respond to it. That would be approved by the management team. And if the scenario ever happens in real life, you have already an approved plan for how to respond to it. So using scenario planning in that way, through the IBP process, you should be at a mature level identifying possible scenarios that may happen in the future and pre-approving responses to what you would do if that scenario happened. So that would be an advanced way of applying scenarios within integrated business planning. All of these scenarios, of course, are based on assumptions. And both Birgit and Dawn have mentioned assumptions in both of their answers so far. So it's critical to understand what assumptions are and how to use them. So we break assumptions down into a number of different categories. So it may be that you have a look at your business and say, are there any assumptions we need to make around political events? Is there anything happening, for example, like Brexit or the US elections? Or do we need to make assumptions about those and prepare scenarios for if it goes one way or another? There may be assumptions that you make around environmental or economic events. What would we do? I have a client that has to make assumptions around the oil price, for example. What would we do if the oil price went above this number or below that number? And they've prepared scenarios for what they would do in those events. You may want to have a think about preparing and monitoring assumptions around the introduction of new technology. If there's going to be a new technology available in the future, that may affect how we manufacture our product. And if that happens earlier, rather than later? What would we do? And you'd prepare a scenario around that. So these are all advanced ways of using scenario planning, which is why I think it's such a great question. And just to wrap up on assumptions, perhaps an assumption around legislation, regulatory framework. It may be an interesting one right now. For your business, in your industry, are you perceiving any changes to the regulatory framework within which you operate? If that does happen, what would your response be? If it doesn't happen, what would your response be? And these are all proactive, future-looking questions that you can raise, discuss within your IBP process, agree on what your answer would be, what your response would be, and have that pre-approved for if and when the event happens. So great question. Thanks for bringing it up. Anything to add, Birgit or Dawn?
I just wanted to add, Gary, could you tell us how often scenarios should be challenged? So when people have done that work that you've mentioned and they've finished that scenario, how often should they revisit that one?
Thanks, Dawn. It's once you've created your scenario, it is of course underpinned by assumptions, and the process, the integrated business planning process, should be continually monitoring those assumptions. And at any point in time when one of those assumptions changes, it's time to revisit the scenario. So it isn't something that you revisit quarterly, you don't revisit annually or even monthly. It's whenever an underlying assumption changes, it's time to revisit the scenario. If all of the assumptions that you've made are still valid, then the scenario that you've created is of course therefore still valid. So no need to revisit it every month. Thanks, Dawn. That brings us to our first polling question. So this is where we get you guys involved. We're gonna put the question up on the screen in a second. You'll be given 5 answers to choose from, and we're really interested in seeing what your responses could be. So if we can get the question on the screen. Magic. So we're interested from all of the attendees today, what is your biggest challenge that you're facing today as an organization right now? Is it satisfying your new and unplanned demand as a result of the COVID pandemic? Is it that you're trying to find ways to operate with social distancing rules? Your biggest challenge might be understanding what your demand is for your products, or it may be keeping people motivated while business has stopped. Or is your biggest challenge managing the end-to-end supply chain, including suppliers and third-party manufacturers? So we're going to pause now and give you a few minutes to pose have a think and put your answers in, and then we'll have a discussion about what those answers might mean. So we'll take a 1 minute pause right now for you to put the answers in. And there we have it. So understanding what demand there is for your products is, of course, a critical one. And from within our client base, with all of the clients we talk to, we're seeing that it is a popular challenge that they're facing. I think up to 72% of our clients that we're speaking to right now are wrestling with what is the true demand for their products right now. So that's why we picked the question number one, the big answered is how do you approach demand planning in these uncertain times? And there shouldn't be any need to panic or do anything differently. As Big answered, follow the standard process, use your assumptions, use your insights, and approach demand planning in the same way. It may be that you have a low level of accuracy right now, and that would be understandable, but you should avoid the introduction of bias into the demand numbers. So an inaccurate number you can deal with through inventory, but if you allow at this point in time bias, either positive or negative, to creep into the number, you are introducing second guessing into your business, and that doesn't end in a good place. Anything to add, Big?
Yeah, from my side, it's a tricky one, and we addressed that with the first question. But I guess maybe in addition to that is what we need to understand, what is driving the change in demand that we are at the moment seeing. So I have customers that have no demand at the moment. I have customers that have increased demands, but then it's the question, is that a temporarily increase because people pile up and then it's things with shelf life, like, let's talk fresh dairy, for example, that will be temporary increase. It will potentially not sustain, though it might drive future increased consumption, but it's something that we understand why that is going up. We then have like demand like toilet paper, right, which is basically pulled forward due to psychological reasons, but this will be creating a lot of irritations here and now, and it then goes into we need to prioritize if that is a root cause of it, of how we manage and whom we manage. But then, there's another category which have a massive shift of their consumption, which is like taking everything that we consumed out of home in restaurants, catering, etc., and now switched to in-home. So sometimes the overall net demand is the same, but it's how we package it and how we sell it is going to be different. So it's trying to understand the causes for that. And again, like similar discussion as we had on the assumptions, go back to that consensus view and the cross-functional insights that we're having, so we then can form our one set of numbers.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Excellent, thank you.
We do have a question, Gary, a sort of comment really on the scenario planning point that you made. The person is saying that they don't really agree with your point about the review period, because he finds that people are often so busy they forget to review the assumptions. So he would suggest at least a 6-monthly more formal review, and wonders what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, it's a valid concern, which is why we advocate in the IBP process that you create a database of assumptions so that they are captured and they're agreed. Often we sit in on meetings with clients, don't we, where there's a debate about what the assumption was, capturing it formally in a database, and that, by database I mean Excel file. That could be something as simple as that. But for each assumption that's been discussed and agreed and captured in the database, it must be assigned to an owner. And the benefit of doing that is the owner then has a clear accountability for monitoring how that assumption is playing out. Yeah. So we talk about an assumption on oil price, and if I'm the person in the organization that's been given ownership of the assumption about oil price, part of my day-to-day job is monitoring whether in the real world it's playing out the way we assumed or not. And part of my day job, therefore, is to raise in the IBP process the fact that there's been a change to our assumption. It's not happening the way we thought. That doesn't mean we were bad. It just means we now know something new. And because of that, now is the time to bring it up and discuss it and debate it and come up with a new scenario.
Yeah, you may well raise it with the facilitator of the relevant review, mightn't you? And you'd have a discussion about, is this change significant enough for us to revisit scenario A, B, or C? Yeah.
Yeah. So thanks, Dawn, for keeping an eye on the questions. Yeah, good question from Peter. So we're coming to our next question, which is back to you, Birgit. And this is, how do we create a change culture that is suitable for these rapidly changing times?
Okay, well, thanks for that. I love people and culture, so that's a really good one. In reality, people are at the moment more exposed to change than ever before, right? We had quite strict rules here on COVID in Bavaria, south of Germany, where I'm living, and you know, good Germans follow the rules. So it's basically daily finding out what we can do, and you know, then having our own view as well on, you know, even though we can already do this now, what is safe to protect our family, our friends, and our customers, as we do have an accountability for our customers as well. And we were very conscious of, you know, when would we go back and in order to do that, but still keeping the business going and life with the support that is needed at the time. Now, a key for creating such a change culture is various aspects, really. The first one really for me would be an environment of trust. So we need to be able to voice our concerns. We need to be able to make mistakes without fearing any implications of that. People should appreciate, you know, that we do mistakes because we learn from them. We need to do them, as we know, in our real life in order to learn. And I'm actually working with several organizations that through the transformation programs that we're on, actually now only start learning really to allow a failure culture, right? So it depends on the industry, depends on where we are from, but it's that environment of trust that is really, really important here. And the other aspect for me, and it's related actually to the trust, is also communication, right? Communication is key. People will worry, whatever we say, whatever we tell, they will worry about their jobs. Even if we don't know what is going to happen, what's the impact going to be, and what is going on in the rest of the organization that might have an impact, we need to be talking about that, and even saying we don't know, we know you worry, we understand, will be such a big game changer, and helping people to articulate their worries and not feel alone. It's better than, you know, leaving people alone and retreat into their shells, if that translates in English. You know, go back into your tiny shell there. Another aspect really is again with moving to virtual, a lot related there. I think is the situational leadership. And it's that new leadership style that is really required, which is helping individuals to, you know, depending on where they stand, and then really again from a safe environment and a trusted partner, and communicating sufficiently, and making sure we manage on where they are. I mean, I've seen a lot of great leaders through this time now as well, that support their people. It's very difficult with young kids. I'm glad mine are old enough to take care of themselves, but it is very difficult, and you know, we need to make sure we're helping people through that change by talking to them and managing as it is. And then I guess last but not least, what I would emphasize based on the prior conversation that we had so far is really stick to your processes. So make sure we're sticking to those. We acknowledge decision-making rights, empowerment, etc. Because nothing is more irritating than in a crisis mode, your boss takes over your role, right? Mm-hmm. So make sure we stick to what we're good at, we stick to the process, and we trust that they are working. But again, have that environment to talk about those. Does that help? I don't know if there's anything to add, Dawn, maybe from your side?
Not at the moment, no.
Okay. Great, and if those questions come out, we will take them. There's none added to this at the moment. Now, the next question, actually, Gary, is for you. What will be the impact of the new normal to the future of manufacturing?
Thanks, Birgit. Another good question. I think obviously manufacturing is going to continue. There'll still be a need for goods, and they'll still need to be made. I think one of the key areas that will be impacted first will be around inventory. So a lot of organizations, as a result of this pandemic, have been caught with the wrong amount of inventory in the wrong place in the supply chain and have felt the pain as a result of that. So while inventory has been a focus point for many years now with regard to reducing inventory, I think one of the first things that will happen as a result of the pandemic is there will be more focus on not so much on reducing inventory, but having the right inventory in the right place in the supply chain to be able to respond to change. I think also, as we spoke earlier about assumptions and scenario planning, there needs to be more discussion around inventory that's being carried for the contingency of something like a pandemic. So we're carrying a base level of inventory to cover the variability in our supply chain, but then we have strategic inventory that we've agreed through a process of creating a scenario that we need to have in place because of a particular event that we foresee. So more focus on having the right amount of inventory in the right place rather than just inventory reduction. I think the second thing that's going to happen in manufacturing is going to be around the need for greater agility. And we've mentioned this in a few of the answers. Dawn spoke about it in her answer to question number 2. There is going to be a need for manufacturing to respond quicker to change. So this may be a change in demand, so that we can see the change in demand and respond quickly. I have one of my clients that didn't respond quick enough to a drop in demand and ended up with a lot of inventory. So, you know, they're feeling the pain for that now, and the IBP process we're putting in place with them will help them avoid that kind of trap in the future. So being agile in responding to change and making the decisions that you need to make early will be a key new need in any manufacturing organization. You look at not only a change to demand, but even a change to your portfolio of products. As we see changes to the assumptions we've made, changes to market insights that we're seeing, let's, as an organization, be more proactive in adjusting and changing our portfolio of products, bring in new products quicker, and capture that need and have the manufacturing capability to do that, but also retiring old products earlier so that we're not bleeding out profits out of the organization. So that's going to be becoming more agile cost effectively is going to be another new or increasingly important need in a manufacturing organization. But possibly more importantly than both of those will be, I think, a heightened need to ensure continuity of supply. Whatever products it is that you're making, to ensure that you have an intact supply chain right from the suppliers all the way through your manufacturing nodes in your supply chain through to your distributors and your logistics part of the supply chain. The need to ensure that that is robust is being heightened by the pandemic that we've just gone through. To be able to move your products quickly to where you need them, it is going to be critical. To be able to do that cost effectively is going to be critical, and to be able to supply your products reliably is going to be critical, and that's a word that is probably most often used in the manufacturing environment. You know, in the commercial world, you can be an entrepreneur, and in the world of science, you can be a brilliant scientist. But in the world of manufacturing, reliable is what you want to be. And the need for that increased reliability and the dependency on reliability is going to be more and more prevalent as organizations weather this crisis, come through the economic impacts on their business. So anything to add to that, Birgit or Dawn? I think I've covered the three most important things I could think of. Birgit?
You know, I think there were a couple of questions in the comment. Maybe just to mention, the comment is about be aware there's a second wave of COVID coming. So learn from the first and apply that now in your scenario planning. I think that's a very valid point. So thanks, Chris, for mentioning that. And then there was a question that intrigued me, which was about you know, what are the what's the role of China as companies are moving away, or some countries are moving to sourcing from India instead. So any comments on that?
Yeah, I saw early on with one of my clients, as the pandemic was breaking, I was sitting in their management business review, and one of the topics they were discussing was reducing their dependency on China. And I see that's one of the questions that has come up. It was quite a popular discussion amongst executive teams as the pandemic was breaking, and a lot of decisions, I think certainly within my client base, were made to ensure we weren't single sourced out of China or to move our production completely out of China. I think personally that was a short-term reaction. And there will be actions taken as a result of that short-term knee-jerk. But I think ultimately things will rebalance back to perhaps not single sourcing out of these developing economies, but not walking away from them completely. So that would be my thought on China. There was another question about organizations that have changed tack completely, and I'd bring up the example of we're a Formula One team manufacturing Formula One cars. That's what we do. The pandemic broke, and immediately they started to change tack to say, what can we use our technology for to develop something new, and started manufacturing ventilators. And that is a brilliant example of what I was talking about, of being agile around your portfolio management. Don't wait for it to happen to you. You've seen the pandemic coming, it's happened. Be agile, make decisions quickly. Indecision is going to be the thing that kills organizations as we go through things like this now and in the future. So use your integrated business planning process to make those longer term decisions, and use your integrated tactical planning process to execute them and make sure you respond quickly.
And I've just add about the supply base again, you know, not just because, you know, even if you were able to be agile in your own organization, I don't think you can assume that all of your suppliers will do that as successfully. So it's even more important now, I think, and going forward, that you increase the focus on monitoring your suppliers, you know, in terms of their financial health, in terms of what, you know, their position is. Have they, you know, how well have they weathered this first wave of the pandemic? Because that also leads to a discussion internally then on if this was a test of your suppliers, who's come up well from that test, and who are you worried about if there is a second wave, and in terms of their longer term health.
Okay, thanks, Dawn. Great. So that brings us to the second set of polling, which we'll run through pretty quickly. Do you want to take us through this, Birgit?
Yes, sure. Once it comes up. So the second polling really is about what do you see as your biggest issue for the future once the crisis has passed. And you know, there's again 5 options which you would want you to click on. First one is ramping volumes back up to satisfy demand. The other one is ensuring that the business is financially secure, and then adapting to the new landscape that may have fewer competitors. And actually, you know, there's loads of changes in the current landscape, especially look at the service organizations, adapting to the new landscape that may have unstable suppliers, which is a bit related to the question we had earlier, and then understanding how to manage our demand in the new world. And yeah, so just make your selection while you are doing that, and whilst I'm waiting up for the results to come up here. Just again from the previous polling and some statistics that were run, it's actually 66% of organizations do see a financial impact lasting up to 24 months from the COVID now. And but then the positive news in a way is that 70% of the organizations felt they have adapted well to remote working. Funny enough, I had last Friday a discussion with another company, and what they said is, well, they were very global before, but all in the office. Going remote, they thought that was very, very simple. In reality, they actually were facing all the issues then, because the internet didn't work, the cameras were on, and you know, all those kind of technical issues there as well. Now, I guess my belief in general, the crisis will last longer, and to Gary's point earlier, we will not go back to the new normal really. Talking to various CEOs, they do see opportunities as well, on the one hand for, you know, their people and more time with family, working more remotely, but then also opportunities from a cost perspective for the business really. So Zoe, are we ready with the answers coming up? Great. Okay, we have a clear winner here with ensuring the business is financially secure. And maybe a few comments here from my side. It is very important that you revisit your portfolio. Again, to Gary's point earlier, streamline what is mandatory and what we can get rid of as well, making sure that we manage that effectively. Adjust the prices. So again, actually yesterday in the radio here, as a result of the impact on the service and the catering and food industry here, it's, you know, there was actually a survey if people tip more, and there was a mixed outcome of it. But it's because, you know, because we understand there has been impact and people have been suffering and being closed for so long. Key is that people will understand, you know, reality, and some companies will not, they will not react, but some will be ready and have done scenarios potentially in their IBP process even, and taking advantage of that. So a big concern is, should you not increase your prices, then somebody else will, and that might be the middleman there as well. So be very conscious on also what people expect, because of the consequences and because things have gotten more expensive to a degree there.
Yeah.
Did you want to add something on that one?
Thanks. I did a blog some time ago about this topic, and just incidentally, that's another really useful go-to area if you're looking for more insights. We're constantly writing blogs on our website that cover topics like this. Our view, when you look at is the business financially secure, is that during times of crisis, you're looking to protect your liquidity ratio more than your profitability ratio. So you could get through with not achieving your profit margin for a period of time. But if you don't have the cash in order to keep the business running, that's how most go out of business and fail. So cash is king, would be the mantra as businesses go through the crisis. So that's what we're talking about right now. The next question we come to is back to you, Birgit. So in the long run, e.g. sort of out to 2025, what would change in the IBP process as we know it today?
Okay,
Over to you.
Thanks. That's an interesting question, especially because it's not necessarily related to COVID in that way here. As some of you might know, we have already moved forward into what we call enterprise business planning, right? So as the S&OP had evolved to IBP, we are now at the enterprise business planning era. And one element of that is technology, right? So the speed, how that goes, and back to COVID, actually looking at the app is out now, and you can see and track with whom you had contact, who had been infected, and find that really fast back. Those things are going fast, and all companies I work with actually do have a digital roadmap, right? And really exploiting that and looking at data availability, right? It is already really big there, and you know, with the COVID app, even more would be available on individual you know, people as well. In reality, at here today, from all the data that are available, only 7% is sorted and only 1% is used. But this will change over time, and what it will do is, with that speed, it will enable you know, enable new things and new possibilities. And you know, back to the scenarios, for example, that Gary was talking about earlier, it actually will have an impact on what we see and what we can predict going forward in the future. Now, the IBP element of decision making as such will reside, right? And it will be key still to have that. And but what we will have at a higher speed of change is increased insights, and that will impact that, you know, how often we revisit portfolio, how often we are relooking at our strategy, and how our strategy and response to changing trends will impact then our supply network as well, and how we revise that. So, so those are some of the factors where companies will need to learn and how to embrace that and how to use that, but not get distracted with sticking to the principles of, you know, short-term versus the midterm. The other aspect is actually back to the question earlier on globalization as well. So it's there's different trends going on here, which is working, you know, working from home has proven to be okay. And then the comment that, you know, Europe is trying to get independent of face masks, right, from China, and trying to be able to, you know, be operating independently with less dependency really in that sense. So from an enterprise business planning perspective, what that means is that organizational setups will change, and actually will potentially change more often, which says the matrix for decision taking within the process will need to be revised more often than today, and roles will actually be changing, and some of them will be overlapping as well over time. And that actually requires very solid processes and business process ownership in order to make sure that we are actually sticking to these processes, and we're revising them as they need. Nothing is worse than having a reorganization but running the old process with the old accountabilities, if that makes sense, right? And for enterprise business planning, then beyond an effective integrated business planning, it does incorporate digital planning. So you know, or it manages the digital disruption that we're having with the signals there, and leveraging latest technologies in order to use that for planning. As I said, it directly links the global strategy into that. And I would say it's more adaptive in feeding the short-term and the tactical execution, so it works effectively over multiple horizons in reality. And yeah, I guess it pushes more the horizons further out as well. So many companies actually are already in their IBP process at 36 months out, but with enterprise business planning, it definitely is moving that horizon as well, because we want to go back to what we said earlier, being agile, flexible, and then profitably growing our business. Anything you wanted to add, Dawn?
Yeah, I was just going to build on the point that you made about some of the role changes in the future. So with enterprise business planning and this digitization, we see that the role of the demand analyst is going to really come to the fore. And I think that the businesses should now start to, if they're not doing it already, should really start to look at that role and start investing in growing internal people, or looking at recruiting people who have that kind of capability. So people who can use the tools that are going to be available and becoming standard to analyze big data very quickly. So for example, if you're in the food or beverage or retail industry, you're going to be able to analyze the impacts of promotions very quickly, and use that data analysis to support decisions about changing your promotional plan going forward based on real understanding of the impacts and dynamic understanding of the impacts. Similarly, from a supply chain perspective, we're seeing more people already moving to supply chain towers, so centralized supply chain planning. And again, that process and those roles are going to be supported by digitization. So just have a think about some of the roles you're going to need to evolve if you don't have those already, and the skills and capabilities that you'll be looking for in those key roles within the IBP process going forward.
Okay, thanks, Dawn. Some great insights there. We have 3 minutes left, so we've perhaps got time for one very short answer. I'm interested, Dawn, on your thoughts on deglobalization. Do you see that happening as a result of the pandemic?
Well, I think more businesses will review what best practice and look at reprofiling their purchases from low-cost countries. I think there were quite a few people kind of jumped on a bandwagon in a way and thought, oh, low-cost country sourcing, that's the thing, we've got to do that, without really working across involving the right people in the decisions about which commodities we were going to move to those, often fairly remote low-cost countries. So, for example, making sure that we're focusing more on common parts, low variety SKUs being sourced from low-cost country sources if they're on extended lead times, whilst the more the variety parts are being sourced locally. So there might be more in-sourced nearby to your production facilities, so that you can improve your agility and your cost-effective agility, which is one of the themes that we've talked about this morning. And as Gary mentioned earlier, I think politics is going to have an influence. Brexit certainly has shaken up sourcing thinking in Europe, not just in the UK. And I think America First is driving more in-country sourcing in the US. So I think those are going to be important influencing factors on all sectors, with the possible exception of fresh food, where freshness is always going to influence sourcing policy.
Yeah, thanks, Dawn. So some really interesting discussions and questions that have come in today. If you've enjoyed this as an attendee, we do this regularly, so please join more of these sessions. Go to our website to have a look at the blogs that are there. There are white papers on our website, but also we're always looking to improve. So we will be sending out a survey looking for your views on what we could do differently. So please fill in the survey. It will help us help you. So thank you very much to the guys that have attended today, to the guys that submitted questions, for the questions that came in as we were going. and thanks to my colleagues Dawn and Birgit for joining me on the panel discussion today. Thank you, everybody.